That's wonderful. I want to start by just acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today. Speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Quandamooka people, I pay my respects to the elders of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. My grandmother, was raised by an Aboriginal family, so I have them to thank for some of my life, I've got to say, and for the land that we are on today. It's amazing to be here. And it's amazing to be a part of this bigger, broader community as well. As a younger man, I did say I saved up for Peter's book, and it has been next to me almost my whole career. It's incredible also to hear Peter talk about Peter Calthorpe, and it's wonderful to be a part of this workshop and part of the networks like DBI and SBE, NRC, and their efforts to accelerate conversations towards climate change. Your work is immensely grateful in terms of the professional inputs that we have and opportunities for us to share this information with the industry that we work with. My topic today is Precincts, the Tragedy of the Commons, Decarbonisation and Natural Systems. You may have read this pre-say, but effectively decades of research since the foundational insights of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And on the back of the wisdom of Indigenous communities, we are still failing to meaningfully engage with the known knowns of sustainability. Too often discussions are made in the ethical void, driven by narrow metrics, staying in a professional lane, or employing terms like green and neutral, which has been the topic of much of my research. Since these decisions fall short of addressing the existential crisis and the ethical challenges we face, whilst the race for decarbonisation is certainly essential, our efforts must be more ambitious, aiming higher, require more thinking and more broad application. Precincts, corridors, as have been touched on today, and walkable nodes offer the opportunity to reimagine our systems, moving beyond the constraints of individual buildings and cars. And we have lived in car-centric models so long, it's hard to imagine different ways of being unless you've travelled or seen examples like Peter shared. And this to embrace a holistic approach, a regenerative natural systems approach when we do. By adopting practices such as rewilding and regeneration of ecosystems, we can transform our building-centric obligations and foster sustainable futures that address the commons, which I'll discuss in some degree. Creating a vision for a future that's worth creating, which is what Peter's been doing a great job of in his whole career. There are exemplar case studies that I'll share with you that have reframed these problems, thinking about them differently, aiming to open up this conversation a little bit more about how we generate and regenerate precincts towards the necessary march towards decarbonisation. I'm going to choose to share with you some interesting ideas that some are from students actually, some are from industry and some are from my projects, but the key reason is the best of my efforts as an architect and working in buildings are no match to really working at a precinct scale. And a building can still perpetuate an unsustainable system, which we see time and time again to varying degrees. And there will be phases for buildings and built environments where they don't work without the nodes and the interconnections of these nodes that work through corridors. And that's okay. We are a work in progress. Some of my thoughts on what is sustainability came from Peter Newman's work and his book, The Blue Book, but also from Professor Tony Fry and his work in a new design philosophy. This is partly because my background is in design and he's a design professor. And one of the concerns that I have is around the terms we use, because the words we use often limit what we can do. And if we can't think of them in words and we can't often draw them, sustainable development can perpetuate the illusion of perpetual production, which is potentially a problem we all see time and time again, which makes us potentially stifled in terms of our actions. Our actions can be seen as sustainments sustaining the unsustainable, or sustainments towards a better, a more sustainable future. And our actions can de-future to various degrees or provide futures. And at the scale of precincts, we can do much more than in one particular building. Behind this image here, you'll see a project we did for Spices, which was effectively a sustaining village of 10 buildings with shared communal facilities, and it was done as a social enterprise build, which produced enormous outcomes, but was at the precinct scale that meant we could share resources to make it possible. It's actually designed for a green hydrogen solution in the future, which has been co-funded by state government at the moment. This has actually been built. Sustainments in the form of the built environment are most visible. So we talk about this and we see this and we can show someone a building in a city and a place. So they have also the power to significantly change our habits and also our futures. So they're quite a powerful thing. So reimagining precincts can sustain futures more than thinking about the building or the transport level alone, and having great impact on our habits and lifestyles and subsequent carbon balance. To reimagine a precinct is a particularly wonderful thing to do. It enables a more sustainable habit to be formed and greater impacts, as Peter's talked about. The habit of walking in a walkable city is a hard thing to imagine in some of the cities we've lived in the last 30 years, but we are starting to see these changes, and every development comes and goes. Reimagining precincts can be an act of absolute defiant humanism and creating a better way of living. And I think this is a key thing, to provide people with alternatives where they want to change their habits, they want to change their investments. And some of Peter's talking about there with the more dense suburbs that are net zero precincts can be a better way to live, but also a better investment. And this, so the rest of us can copy them. So if we can copy great examples, it's a lot easier, but to create them from nothing is challenging. One of the speakers today will be from WSP, who have long been supporting some of my projects for many years. And this Spices project in the background was one of the ones that started with the WSP report. One of the things that WSP recently spoke about in Victoria, which I was very impressed by, was how they reframed the questions of Victoria, Infrastructure Victoria, on how and where they do things, knowing that as soon as they start to design and construct things, they will be in fact having a carbon impact. And to do nothing, and the project itself in that limited view can actually be seen as a net zero project in itself. To do nothing can be a great thing. But how we do that in buildings is typically by adapting our lifestyle to make them work. In cities, however, it's worth the capital investment, the carbon investment, to make these changes at a precinct level, because they make a whole precinct and a whole city more sustainable. So you might have a small carbon impact from a project, but it is well worth that offset. So that is the topic of today. And what led us to these cities that are potentially and near unlivable and where we are is partly to do with a story called The Tragedy of the Commons. Some people are aware of this. It's more of a common story told in the design language in universities in London, the AA, things like that. And the story goes like this. The Tragedy of the Commons is an economic theory that describes a situation where individuals acting in their self-interest deplete a shared resource, ultimately harming the long-term availability of that resource and an entire community. This concept highlights the conflict between individual interests and the common good, leading to the averse overuse of common resources such as water, land, or air, which we all are aware of. It serves as an argument, though, and it was served as an argument many years ago from the 1600s onwards to reclaim common land, which everyone used for the people, particularly the poor, for living, and created a human rights issue. And so it served as an argument for the establishment of property rights and privatisation and government regulation to manage shared resources effectively. However, because the commons were an integral part and a backbone of society, it took many hundreds of years to do this. And at that time, what happened was closure acts and things like that in the UK, for an example, replaced the communal system and with privatised agricultural land. And what we've seen is this industrial revolution then brought a new form of enclosure with the proliferation of terraced housing and the backyard effectively closing off all public spaces, making everything private, fostering an ideal centred around solitude rather than society. So I'm painting a bit of a picture here. This particular conversation came out of a project by Rebecca Jack from the AA this year. The prioritisation of private ownership in individual plots over shared public space is reflected in the design of the suburbia we now know, and also urban developments of today. So that blocks a lot of pedestrianisation and a lot of public spaces, and means that people live in isolation, and it causes a lot of problems. Precinct level design can humanise space. Rebecca follows closely Alison Smithson's MAT building, which is a lot like what we've seen in the diagrams of cities that Peter showed earlier today, where it looks at redesigning precincts using flexibility and adaptability, interconnecting spaces, efficient use of space, community-oriented design, and integration with the environment. Now, there's a project that looked at Frankfurt, Berlin, Venice, Kuwait, Valencia, in this idea of looking at a MAT building. And you can see here they look like mats, so it looks like a pattern. Effectively, what Rebecca did in one of her projects is what's been talked about from Melbourne University as well, in that we can share resources. So these black lines show that they're shared resources in precincts and interconnection of resources, not just from one building, but one resource to many buildings. The other thing that Rebecca looked at in her studies is that we can reinvent and cut open these fragmented blocks to make pedestrianism as a movement and new pedestrian as a model across urban design and rethinking spaces. This is not uncommon. We see this, however, used more for funneling people for the purposes of shopping centres and retail. However, this can be used for community engagement, community-oriented design, and integration with the environment. Fostering connections between spaces and users, the layout encourages social interaction and the use of community among the inhabitants, designed to harmonise their surroundings, blending architecture and the landscape, which we are slowly getting to on projects. But to pull down someone's fence and boundary fence is still considered taboo in Brisbane, but we are working on it. The prioritisation of shared public infrastructure and space serves as a catalyst to ignite social life in a city. And Rebecca's projects are a great example of this. The prioritisation of shared public space and shared commons, to use another word, for equity as a priority, also offers and provides the opportunity to rewild, providing spaces for either agriculture or wilderness. So more dense urban frameworks, but bringing the wilderness into the city. The loss of the commons was not just a matter of economic displacement, but of cultural dislocation, severing people from customs and shared responsibilities that wants to find their way of life. We have lost that. We have seen that lost in Indigenous communities as well. The precinct level design thinking can, however, offer better ways to live, ways long forgotten, no longer seen in the archetype or planning schemes of today. Precinct level design can remove car dominance, rewild places, reduce watershed, reduce roads, humanise built forms, and be a change agent. This idea that Rebecca spoke about, she termed the city as the house and the countryside as the garden. But it's been done by many people over many years in many different ways. And it's really using old principles of ownership. Principle level design can offer compact and affordable living because of this, because of shared infrastructure and living outdoors. This idea here by Alison Peter-Smithson, the house of the future, is compact thanks to the precincts of the future perhaps and the map building idea. So new pedestrianism. Another concept that I'd like to maybe bring as a call to action is ethical carbon. And Anne Schumacher's work in ethical carbon of recent years has been quite interesting. She's a PhD candidate in Perth, actually. Anne asks how we shift from a purely technical framework to sustainability is a question to one that is deeply ethical and sustainable and deeply human-centred. It's something that's of interest to her. And she asks, what does a precinct look like when its sustainability metrics include not just embodied carbon, but also the carbon counted from embodied people and labour? One of the definitions she asserts is that embodied people and labour refers to the concept of labour that is inherently linked to the production process and the materials used in creating a product. Embodied labour is particularly significant when considering the ethical implications of carbon neutrality and the hidden exploitation within supply chains, which is something that my work works in as well. If we believe we can design for net zero precincts, then why can't we design for net zero exploitation? Precincts through ethical carbon. Climate justice and social justice are not separate battles, but deeply interlinked. The precincts of the future cannot just be low carbon or offset net zero emissions. They must be ethical, just and humane. They must embody ethical carbon to achieve social neutrality is Ehrman's assertion. I suggest the same. Also, we can look at regeneration. Now, this is a conversation that's been had in many different forms and many different topics over the last couple of years, but we've seen it in our projects, particularly with what in the background here with the work that Spices Retreats did in rejuvenating and regenerating spaces and reconnecting parks and wildlife that were cut off by farming. But how do we bring this into the precinct and influence regeneration? The use of natural systems to rewild places isn't as common close to cities, but in one of our projects in Surat, where industrial processes and industrial farming were altered and natural systems were used for 20 years, There was a process where the Pride family in Surat invested 20 years of their life utilising cattle to regenerate land. The interesting element of this is using natural sequence farming, they brought back the land to a state that UQ researchers said they hadn't seen and other parts of the area hadn't seen for tens of years, maybe hundreds of years. So it was almost back to the state it was before colonial inhabitation of lands for farming. This is pretty amazing to be able to do this in 20 years. These sorts of spaces and bringing rural activities closer to cities is possible by using cities differently and rethinking the way we generate our food, and also potentially as a way to minimise the risk of climate change. Precincts can be large enough to enable design that is utilising natural systems farming and can regenerate natural ecosystems. And in designing for housing modifications for this site, another interesting element of this project was it became very apparent that they had an unlimited budget, but there was a minimum viable product, and that would be a $10,000 intervention, an architectural intervention, which was very simple, which would give them the outcomes. And that's ultimately the way we went, which was achievable in weeks and not years and had a lot less carbon challenges. Other regenerative installations outside of urban environments, but in the commons that we've been involved with, have been in the Red Sea. And this work with marine biologist out of Brisbane, Brett Kettle, who investigated the benefit of built installations to regenerate wild places, particularly to do with a reef that was to be scanned. And in his work, he scanned 351 kilometres, finishing just last month, of continuous reef, the largest scan ever done in the world of anything like this, and the largest survey of any marine area that has a reef involved. He tagged every single fish, every millimetre of coral, utilising AI with an interesting technology. And this vision also mapped water movements and allowed the idea, and we could then model how an intervention could increase water movement, which would sustain coral for longer, because climate change is affecting habitats as well as cities. With a vision that any and all damage to reef can be tracked and verified from any development in the area, and also that any intervention could be measured. These are some interesting images that we use to generate the revenue for this. Obviously, these are all ideas, but this was ideas that were built ideas that inspired the funding to get the research to do the scanning. So it's something that we don't have a measure on, is a lot of wild places we don't actually have a measure on the impacts that we're having. So this work was quite seminal, quite interesting. Current scanning of the reef is questioned a lot of development in the area as well, and has seen change in the period of 4 months. So it's been quite instrumental. Social impact is another aspect that's a big part of our work, and Creating Positive Futures, or CPF, asks for outcomes on every project. Outcomes in manufacturing, pathways to employment, pathways that are values-based, and we have values-based mentoring as part of this work that we do with them. These pathways also help kids that don't quite fit into schools finish their education and get into higher education, but they also help self-efficacy, which is something that cities and designer buildings can do. Every project we work on could do this. We've done this with Spices, we've done this with other projects, and we can measure the social impacts and the monetary benefit to the developer in the same way Peter talked about the monetary benefit of net zero. If every project had a net zero aim and ambition, and also a social impact aim and ambition, it could be well worth the investment and could be co-invested by other people as well. We've seen that by private investment and also government investment. Whilst Treasury and other organisations privately don't quite understand the measurements we have, we do verify this with ASVB by third-party calculations and included in all of our business cases. And this has meant that we're awarded projects because of these. So it is measured, it's just not measured quite yet on a balance sheet, but it does make a difference. There are some physical myths around net zero aims and working precinct scales, and also for social impact around this as well. We find the physical myths aren't at what people seem. The outcomes from social enterprise deliver more value to the community, that is certain. It's the economics that actually need to catch up. So the ASVP third-party assessments and justifying all the work we do, whether it be in net zero or social impact, is particularly important for the investors, important for the community, because the capital spend needs to make sense. And in some instances, the investment in social impact was well worth the capital investment of the building and the cost of the building before we even opened the doors. So we've had lots of examples of that in housing. We do have challenges in the building code in Australia that Marcy Webster Menison has some thoughts on. And I've been following her work, and we've been getting her to present to the original authors of the Building Code of Australia, who are still alive. And they find this quite interesting because the metrics are justified by, say, the CSIRO for the current building code, for changing the energy rating schemes and the systems. But what we're finding is we're missing the passive design core principles aren't embedded in the building code. They are allowed, but to now achieve them, to have bigger windows, cross ventilation work in your favour before you need to turn on air conditioning is more challenging and provides and the only pathway really when we talk to the Building Codes Board is to provide performance solutions. It should be the normal. So this is an argument that I think we should bring to the fore with all our work towards net zero. Authenticity is also a question that comes up in all of our work. One thing that I find quite challenging is the Planning Act in Queensland. It adopts an unusual definition of ecological sustainability, saying it is a balance of economic development. It's quite different. Sustainable development might incorporate this, but there's certainly some challenges around the language we're using to get away with developing the way we always have, as opposed to making changes we need to. This endless financialisation is strange. Frederick Jameson says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than imagine the end of capitalism, and that may be true. But also the chief economist of the World Bank after the GFC was a guy called Paul Romer, and he said macroeconomics, this science of capitalism that we're relying on, it's something like a fantasy field equivalent to string theory that no longer has any legitimate claim to describing the workings of the real economy accurately anyway. So my question to you is, why does it continue to have a hold over us? There's two things that strike me across all the things that I've read and all the work that we've done. One is sunk cost bias and no ready alternative. And climate change will certainly undermine growth, there's no doubt about that. But it will be pushing the poor and punishing them more dramatically to make changes than the rich. And so potentially that's why we haven't seen enough change. Rachel Bernstein asks, can precincts enable us to rediscover our connections with nature and recognise interdependence and equality so that no person or living thing is left behind? And Tony Fry says, design got us here. Design is also an answer. The challenge is the paradox of knowledge and the change required. The more we know, the more we don't know. And this comes from an idea of information as an island, and the shoreline becomes larger as we gain more knowledge. And so understanding more and more about climate change doesn't necessarily change our minds or deeds. And so there's a habit change required and choices need to change. And I believe that some of the mastery for engineers and architects that have worked in this space for a long time is how we've maintained the push to drive awareness, to have people's choices change and to change habits. Mastery of change, like an ADCAR model, helping people become aware, create a desire to make change, providing the right knowledge like forums like this do, to take action in every project wherever possible and to reinforce the positive values of all those projects is so important. This is also why the value of research, the SBNE, SBNRC, and also opportunities like this forum, create persistent awareness, are so important. Why it's worth professionals taking their time out to be involved in research at all times. It is true that the energy used in buildings can be cut to almost zero through effective climate appropriate design, and we can use offsets and net zero targets, and the technology is there and the drive is there. But so why is there inertia still? There's also this concept of the diffusion of innovation, which Peter talked to, which is the speed of social change. The technology is there, where if we have the cascading element of this waterfall effect, we're on the other side of it now in terms of cost. This is also another reason why research and industry needs to keep envisioning a future worth the rest of us copying, and why events like this are so important. So what we've covered today is sustaining the unsustainable, the illusion of perpetual productivity, equity, slavery, the commons, regenerative installations, and the paradox of knowledge, and also change theory, and the diffusions of innovation theory. In summary, while we race to decarbonise, the necessary efforts have to take place in terms of every project. We need to keep pushing, but I believe we need to be more ambitious, aiming higher, requiring more broadly, more ethical considerations and equity considerations. And precincts and corridors and walkable nodes offer the opportunity to reimagine our systems, moving beyond the constraints of individual buildings and cars to embrace a holistic approach, regenerating natural systems when we do. I appreciate your time and thanks so much for offering the chance to be a keynote today.